The harmattan of December 2021 did not care for the joy of Christmas. It blew through the wide manicured boulevards of Abuja like a ghost, coating the windshields of expensive SUVs in a fine persistent layer of Saharan dust. Inside the cabin of a weathered metallic green Peugeot, Sergeant David Okoro gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned a chalky white against his dark skin. Beside him, Chidinma, his wife, his anchor, the woman who had waded through 3 deployments to the northeast, was doubled over. Her breath came in ragged rhythmic hitches that cut through the low hum of the car's engine. "David," she gasped, her hand finding his forearm, her nails digging into the tough fabric of his Nigerian army camouflage
We are almost
sleeve.
there, my love.
The pressure, it's
Just hold
changing.
It
It's
hurts,
not like
David.
before.
The bombs.
"We are almost there, Chimamaka," David replied,
We are
his
almost
voice
there,
a
my
forced
love.
calm, the tactical
Just
tone
hold
he
on.
used when
It
directing
hurts,
men through a
David.
valley. "Silver
bombs.
Crest is just around this bend. The best doctors. I promised you." He pushed the car harder. David had spent the last 6 months in a dusty outpost near Maiduguri, dreaming of this moment. He had survived IEDs and midnight ambushes just to be the man who walked his wife through the white doors of a hospital. He was a state agent, a man of the law and the sword, but today, he felt smaller than a grain of sand. He was just a father-to-be, terrified of a battle he couldn't fight with a rifle. They pulled into the gates of Silver Crest Medical Center. It was a beautiful sprawling complex, an architectural marvel of glass and white stone that looked more like a 5-star hotel than a place of pain. Bougainvillea flowers, vibrant purple and red, spilled over the perimeter walls, nodding in the dry wind. The security guards at the gate saw David's uniform, the crisp desert camo, the rank on his chest, and straightened their backs, waving him through with a respectful salute. David didn't see the salute. He only saw the sliding glass doors of the emergency wing. Inside, the hospital was a sanctuary of cool air and the faint, sharp scent of eucalyptus and bleach. The floors were polished marble, reflecting the bright LED recessed lighting above. But as David helped Chidinma toward the reception desk, the aesthetic beauty of the building began to peel away to reveal the strain of 2021. The pandemic had left the healthcare system hollowed out, even the beautiful hospitals were running on fumes and exhausted staff. "My wife," David said, his voice booming slightly too loud for the quiet lobby. "She is in labor. Contractions are 3 minutes apart." A receptionist looked up from a computer screen, her eyes red-rimmed from a double shift. "Registration first, officer. Do you have your HMO or are you private?" "Private. Anything. Just get her a bed." David's eyes flashed with a sudden, sharp intensity. A nurse appeared with a wheelchair, not sister Patience, but a younger girl named Joy. She saw the sweat on Chidinma's brow and the way the woman was biting her lip to keep from screaming. "Bring her. Fast," Joy commanded. As they wheeled Chidinma away toward the delivery wing, David tried to follow, but a set of double doors stopped him. "Wait here, Sergeant," Joy said kindly. "We need to prep her. The doctor is being called." David stood in the hallway, his boots clicking on the marble as he paced. He looked at his hands. They were steady, military training ensured that, but his heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He found a small waiting alcove with a view of the hospital's inner courtyard. In the center of the garden stood a statue of a mother holding a child, surrounded by dry grass that had turned yellow in the harmattan. It was supposed to be peaceful, but to David, the statue looked lonely. Hours bled into one another. The beautiful environment of Silver Crest became a gilded cage. David watched the moon climb high over the Abuja skyline. He saw the shift change at 10 p.m. He saw a cleaner buffing the floors, the machine making a lonely, whirring sound in the vacant corridor. Every time a door opened, David leaped to his feet. "Is she okay?" "Not yet, sir. Be patient." Around 2 a.m., the silence of the wing was shattered. He heard Chidinma's voice, a high piercing cry of agony that bypassed his ears and went straight to his soul. Then, there was a flurry of movement. Doctors in green scrubs ran past him. One carried a tray of instruments that rattled with a metallic, ominous cling. David moved to the door of the delivery ward, his face pressed against the small circular window. He couldn't see Chidinma, only the reflection of the overhead surgical lights. He began to pray. He wasn't a man who frequented the chapel often, but he spoke to God then with the desperation of a soldier in a foxhole. "Save them. Take me, but save them." Then came the sound. It wasn't the healthy, robust wail of a newborn that you see in the movies. It was a wet, gurgling struggle, a weak, thin sound like a kitten gasping for air. A few minutes later, Dr. Emeka stepped out. He was a tall man with spectacles, his brow drenched in sweat. He looked at David's uniform and then at his tired face. "Sergeant Okoro?" "Doctor. My wife? My child." "Your wife, Chidinma. She is a strong woman. She had a severe hemorrhage, but we have stabilized her. She is resting. She is a survivor." David felt the air return to his lungs. "And the boy? I heard him." The doctor's expression dimmed. "The baby inhaled meconium, the birth water. It has entered his lungs. It's a very serious condition, Sergeant. We have moved him to the neonatal intensive care unit, NICU. He is on oxygen. The next few hours, they are life and death." The joy David expected to feel was replaced by a cold, heavy dread. He was allowed to see Chidinma for only a moment. She was pale, her beautiful face drained of color, her hair matted to her forehead. She was drifting in a sedative-induced sleep, her hands twitching as if searching for the child that had been inside her hours before. "I'm here, Chidinma," David whispered, kissing her knuckles. "I'm here. Our boy is a fighter. He has your spirit." He couldn't stay. The nurses moved her to a recovery ward, and David was directed toward the NICU on the 3rd floor. The 3rd floor was the elite wing. The walls were adorned with framed paintings of landscapes, and the lighting was soft and amber. But at the end of the hall sat the NICU, a room sealed by heavy glass doors. David arrived there at 4 a.m. He was exhausted. He hadn't slept in 36 hours, having driven straight from his post to pick up Chidinma for the hospital run. The adrenaline that had sustained him was curdling into a deep, bone-aching fatigue. He looked around. There were no beds for fathers here. Only a single, hard plastic chair near the glass entrance. David sat. Then, his body simply gave up. He didn't mean to sleep, but his head hit the wall behind him, and the world went black. He dreamt of the desert. He dreamt of the sound of water, rushing, drowning water. In his dream, he was trying to reach into a river to pull out a small reaching hand, but the water was made of glass. He woke up with a start as a pair of white nursing shoes clicked loudly past his head. The sun was just beginning to bleed a dull orange over the horizon, signaling the start of a new day in 2022. David wiped his face, feeling the grit of the harmattan and the salt of dried sweat. He stood up, his joints popping, and walked to the glass door of the NICU. Inside, under a halo of blue phototherapy light, lay a tiny, fragile bundle. His son. Baby Chidi. The boy's chest was heaving, a tiny rib cage straining against the air, a tube inserted into his nose. He looked so small in the vast high-tech room. "He's waiting for me," David whispered to the empty hallway. He didn't know then that the beautiful environment of Silver Crest was about to become a battleground. He didn't know that the enemy wouldn't be a disease or a complication, but the cold, indifferent heart of a woman in a white uniform. He adjusted his belt, straightened his military tunic, and stood at attention in front of the glass. He was a soldier on guard. He would not leave this post until his son walked out of that room. The silence of the NICU corridor was clinical, almost surgical in its coldness. It was 4:45 a.m. The golden hue of the hallway's designer lamps seemed to mock David's internal state. He stood with his forehead pressed against the reinforced glass of the intensive care unit, watching the rhythmic, desperate rise and fall of baby Chidi's chest. The child looked like a miniature soldier himself, fighting a war against the fluid in his lungs, his tiny fists clenched as if ready to strike at the air that refused to sustain him. The heavy internal door of the NICU hissed open. Out stepped a woman whose presence seemed to suck the warmth from the hallway. Sister Patience did not walk. She marched with a rigid bureaucratic stiffness that suggested she viewed patients not as people, but as line items on a ledger. Her nursing cap was pinned so tightly it seemed to pull the corners of her eyes back, giving her a permanent expression of disdain. She didn't look at the baby. She looked at David's uniform, specifically the dust on his boots and the sweat salt stains on his camouflage shoulders. To her, this man represented the trouble that military families brought to private wards: loud voices, high expectations, and an aura of command that she took as a personal insult. "Sergeant," she said, her voice a sharp, nasal drone. "You are still standing here? You want to break the glass with your eyes." David straightened, reflexively falling into a position of attention. "I am watching my son, sister. The doctor said he is stable, but he looks like he is struggling. Of course he is struggling, she snapped, pulling a carbon copy prescription pad from her pocket. He drank the birth water. His lungs are heavy. If you want him to breathe, you need to stop staring and start moving. She ripped a yellow slip of paper from the pad and thrust it toward his chest. David caught it before it could flutter to the marble floor. What is this? The order, she replied, using the hospital slang for emergency requisitions. Surfactant. Antibiotics. Specific 4 fluids we don't keep in the general ward. Our pharmacy is closed for inventory, end of the year, you know. You must go to the 24-hour depot in WAS 2. If you don't bring these within the hour, the ventilator will just be pumping air into a vacuum. Go. David didn't ask questions. In the army, when an officer gave an order during a crisis, you moved. He didn't stop to think about why a prestigious hospital like Silver Crest had a closed pharmacy during a life-or-death emergency. He didn't think about the ethics of a father being sent on a logistics run while his child lay dying. He only thought about the list. David sprinted. The sound of his heavy combat boots echoed through the empty lobby like a drumbeat. He burst through the sliding doors and into the biting harmattan wind. The air was thick with the scent of burning brush and dust, making his own lungs sting. He jumped into his Peugeot, the engine groaning as it turned over. He checked his fuel gauge. The needle was hovering dangerously close to the red E. It was December 2021, and Nigeria was gripped by one of the worst fuel scarcities in recent memory. Lines at the filling stations stretched for kilometers, filled with angry drivers sleeping in their cars. Not today, David prayed, gripping the gear shift. Please, not today. He tore out of the hospital gates, the tires screeching on the asphalt. The streets of Abuja were eerie at this hour. The streetlights were intermittent, the national grid was flickering, leaving vast stretches of the capital in total darkness. He drove like a man possessed, weaving through the yellow fever taxis that were already beginning to prowl the junctions. He reached the first pharmacy in WAS. The neon sign was off. He hammered on the security gate, the metal clanging in the quiet street. We are closed. No power. A voice shouted from behind the steel. I have an emergency. A baby. David roared. No medicine here. Go to the junction. David jumped back in the car. His heart was a frantic bird trapped in a cage. He could see Chidi's face in his mind, the blue tint to the boy's lips. Every red light he ran felt like a gamble with the law he was sworn to uphold, but today, he served a higher authority, the life of his firstborn. He finally found the 24-hour depot near the central business district. It was crowded with other desperate people, men in pajamas, women with tear-streaked faces, all victims of a healthcare system that required the sick to provide their own miracles. David pushed to the front, his uniform acting as a silent, grim battering ram. The pharmacist, a harried man behind a glass partition, took the slip. This is expensive, Sergeant. And we only have 2 vials left. Take my card. Take everything. Just give me the drugs, David gasped, his breath coming in ragged bursts. The transaction felt like it took a lifetime. The POS machine took forever to dial, the processing circle spinning on the screen like a countdown to a funeral. When the bag was finally handed to him, David clutched it to his chest as if it were a downed comrade. The drive back to Silver Crest was a blur of adrenaline and fear. As he pulled back into the hospital grounds, the sun was fully up, a pale, sickly disk hanging in the dusty sky. He didn't park properly, he simply abandoned the car near the entrance, the engine still ticking as it cooled. He ran. Up the stairs, bypassing the elevator. His legs were screaming, but he didn't feel the pain. He reached the 3rd floor, the bag of medicine swinging in his hand. He reached the NICU doors, breathless and sweating, his heart leaping with the hope that he had made it in time. But when he reached the glass, he stopped dead. The room was different. The blue light was still humming, but the baby, his Chidi, was moving violently. The child's tiny legs were kicking, his head thrashing from side to side. The monitors above the incubator were flashing a frantic, silent red. The heart rate was climbing, the oxygen saturation dropping into the 70s. David looked around the room through the glass. It was empty. There was no nurse. No doctor. No sister patients. The monitors were screaming, their digital alarms muffled by the expensive soundproof glass, but there was no one inside to hear them. David pounded on the door. It was locked with an electronic keypad. He didn't have the code. "Hey, someone. The baby," he shouted, his voice cracking. He turned and saw Sister Patience coming down the hall from the direction of the staff lounge. She was holding a steaming mug of tea, walking with a leisurely, measured gait that suggested she was on a Sunday stroll in the park. "Sister, the medicine. I have it." David ran toward her, holding out the bag. "And the baby, look at the baby. The alarms are flashing." Patience didn't speed up. She took a slow sip of her tea, her eyes scanning David with a look of extreme irritation. "Sergeant, I told you before. This is a hospital, not a parade ground. Stop shouting. You are disturbing the VIPs in the other wing." "Disturbing? My son is dying in there. Look through the glass." Patience sighed, a long, theatrical sound. She didn't even look toward the NICU. "Babies cry, Sergeant. Monitors glitch. I have to finish my report before I can administer new medication. Give me the bag and go and sit down." "Take it now. Go inside." David's voice was a low growl now, the sound of a predator being pushed to the edge. "I will go inside when I am ready," she replied, her voice dripping with a poisonous calm. She looked at his camouflage uniform with a sneer. "You people think because you carry a gun, everyone must jump when you snap your fingers. Not here. Here, I am the one in charge. Keep your products. I am going to the pharmacy to check something else first." She turned her back on him. David stood there, the bag of life-saving medicine in his hand, watching the woman walk away while his son's life force flickered like a candle in a gale behind a wall of glass he couldn't break. The silence of the hallway returned, broken only by the muffled rhythmic thump-thump-thump of David's own heart, and the sight of a tiny hand through the window, reaching for an air that wasn't there. The air in the hallway of Silver Crest felt like it had been sucked into a vacuum. David stood paralyzed for a heartbeat, caught between the instinct to smash the glass door with his combat boot and the terrifying knowledge that doing so might somehow endanger the fragile life inside. Through the window, baby Chidi's movements were becoming erratic, spasmodic jerks that signaled the brain was screaming for the oxygen the lungs couldn't provide. David turned away from the glass, his eyes locking onto the retreating back of Sister Patience. She was moving toward the nursing station, her gait leisurely, the steam from her tea trailing behind her like a taunt. "Madam." David's voice didn't just carry, it commanded. It was the voice of a man who had held the line at the Sambisa fringes, a voice that demanded the earth itself stop turning. Patience stopped. She didn't turn around immediately. She let a 3-second silence hang in the air, a calculated move to show who held the power in this corridor. When she finally pivoted, her face was a mask of cold, bureaucratic indignation. "Sergeant Okoro," she said, her voice dropping into a dangerous, whisper-thin tone. "I have told you. There are other patients. There are protocols. You are not on a battlefield, you are in a sanctuary of healing. If you raise your voice one more time, I will have security escort you to the gate." David took 3 long strides toward her. He didn't invade her personal space, but he stood close enough for her to see the bloodshot veins in his eyes and the tremble of suppressed fury in his hands. He held up the plastic bag from the pharmacy. "My son is not a protocol," David said, his voice vibrating with a terrifying low-frequency intensity. "I have been to the ends of this city. I have the drugs. The monitor in that room is screaming red. If you don't take these products and enter that room right now, you are not a nurse, you are an executioner." Sister Patience looked down at the bag, then up at David's face. She didn't see a grieving father, she saw a uniform trying to bully her. In her mind, she had been at Silver Crest for 15 years. She had seen ministers, senators, and generals. She had developed a thick crust of cynicism as a defense mechanism against the chaos of the Nigerian medical system. To her, David was just another aggressive man trying to jump the queue of fate. "I am going to the supply room to get the correct syringe sizes," she lied, her eyes never wavering. "The ones you bought are likely the wrong gauge for a neonate. And as for the monitors, they are sensitive. They trigger for every little movement. If I ran every time a light flashed, I would never finish my rounds." "Go inside and check," David pleaded, his anger suddenly giving way to a raw, naked desperation. "Please. I am begging you. Just look at him. He's not moving like he was before. He's slowing down." Patience adjusted her cap, her fingers lingering on the pin as if she were adjusting a crown. "Keep the products, Sergeant. I am going to the other wing first to check on a VIP's mother. She has a real emergency, her blood pressure is spiking. I will be back in 10 minutes. Do not move from that spot." She turned to leave again, her shoes clicking a rhythmic indifferent no against the marble floor. "Madam," David called out, his voice cracking. "I am warning you. I am a man of peace, but I am also a man of duty. My duty is to that boy. If you walk away now, and I realize that my baby is dying because you chose to drink tea and check on VIPs, it will not be easy between you and me. I have seen the face of death, sister. Do not make me show it to you." Patience stopped. She slowly turned back, a sneer curling her upper lip. She looked him up and down, from his dusty beret tucked into his epaulette to the scuffed tips of his boots. "Are these threats, Sergeant? Are you threatening a medical professional in the line of duty?" She stepped closer, her voice loud enough now to attract the attention of a junior nurse at the far end of the hall. "You think that uniform makes you a god? Here, you are just a man with a sick child and a loud mouth. Your warnings mean nothing to me. I have seen bigger men than you cry in these hallways. Wait your turn." She didn't just walk away this time, she dragged her feet slightly, a deliberate display of lethargy. She turned the corner into the staff break room, disappearing from his sight. David was alone again in the gilded silence of the third floor. He turned back to the glass. Baby Chidi was no longer thrashing. That was the most terrifying part. The frantic energy had left the tiny body. The boy lay still, his chest making shallow, irregular hitches. The water in his lungs was winning. The blue light of the incubator felt like a spotlight on a tragedy. David pressed his palms against the glass. "Breathe, Chidi. Breathe, my son. Daddy is here. I have the medicine. Just one more breath." Seconds felt like hours. He looked at the clock on the wall, 5:12 a.m. At 5:15 a.m., he saw a shadow move behind him. He spun around, hoping it was the doctor. It was only a janitor, lazily pushing a mop, his headphones on, completely oblivious to the life-and-death struggle occurring 3 feet away. David felt a surge of violent energy, a desire to rip the door off its hinges, to grab the oxygen mask himself, to do something. But he was a prisoner of the glass. He was a state agent, a man who had commanded squads, now reduced to a helpless spectator. At 5:22 a.m., Sister Patience finally reappeared. She wasn't running. She wasn't even walking quickly. She was chatting with a younger nurse, laughing softly at some private joke. She held a clipboard in one hand and her empty tea mug in the other. She saw David standing by the door, his face a mask of such profound grief and rage that even she hesitated for a fraction of a second. "The products," she said, reaching out a hand as if she were asking for a stick of gum. David handed her the bag. His hand was shaking so violently the plastic rattled. "Go," he whispered. "Please. Just go." Patience swiped her card. The lock clicked, a sound like a gunshot in the quiet hall. She stepped inside the NICU. David watched. He saw her walk to the incubator. He saw her look at the monitors, which were now flatlining into a single continuous high-pitched hum that even the soundproof glass couldn't fully drown out. He saw her posture change. The arrogance vanished. The stiffness in her shoulders collapsed into a frantic, jerky motion. She dropped the bag of medicine on the floor, the very medicine David had risked his life to get, and it slid across the tiles, ignored. She began to pump a tiny manual respirator. She pressed a button on the wall, and suddenly, the code blue lights began to swirl in the hallway outside. "No," David breathed, his forehead hitting the glass. "No, no, no." Doctors began to swarm the room. Dr. Emeka appeared from a side door, his surgical mask hanging off one ear, his eyes wide with alarm. They crowded around the small plastic box, their bodies blocking David's view of his son. David watched the clock. 5:28 a.m. 5:30 a.m. The movement inside the room slowed down. The frantic energy dissipated. One by one, the doctors stepped back. Dr. Emeka looked down at his watch. He said something to the room, the time of death. Sister Patience was the first to move toward the door. She looked through the glass at David before she opened it. For the first time, her eyes held something other than disdain. They held fear. Not fear of David's uniform, but fear of the silence she had created. The door hissed open. "Sergeant," she began, her voice trembling, the sister persona completely shattered. We did everything we could. There was a sudden collapse. "We are so sorry. The child is dead." David didn't move. He didn't shout. He didn't strike her. He simply looked past her, into the room. He saw the bag of medicine he had bought, the order, lying on the floor, still sealed, still cold from the pharmacy's refrigerator. It sat in a puddle of spilled tea that had leaked from the mug patients had set down in her hurry. "It wasn't the water," David said, his voice so quiet it was almost a hum. "It was the time. You took the time, and you gave it to the VIPs. You gave it to your tea." He looked at her name tag, Patience. "You told me to wait my turn," David whispered, his eyes finally meeting hers. "My son's turn is over." In that moment, the beautiful high-end environment of Silver Crest felt like a tomb. And as David turned to see Chidinma limping down the hallway, clutching her stomach and searching for her husband's face, the true weight of the tragedy began to settle into the marrow of his bones. While David stood as a sentinel of grief in the corridor, the tragedy was being woven in two other corners of the Silver Crest Medical Center. To understand the depth of the failure, one must look behind the closed doors of the staff break room and into the hazy, pain-filled recovery ward where a mother's intuition was sounding an alarm that no monitor could match. In the staff break room, the air was thick with the scent of fried plantains and cheap air freshener. It was a small room, tucked away from the prying eyes of the VIPs, a sanctuary where the staff could shed their professional masks. Sister Patience stood before a small cracked mirror taped to the back of the door. She wasn't thinking about the order in David's hand or the flickering red lights in the NICU. She was thinking about her hair. She adjusted her nursing cap, pulling out a few stray strands of her weave and tucking them back with a hiss of annoyance. "These people, I swear," she muttered to Nurse Bimbo, a junior intern who was scrolling through her phone on the plastic sofa. "They come here with their camouflages and their SG titles, thinking they can command me in my own ward. Did he think he was at a checkpoint?" Bimbo didn't look up, her thumb rhythmic on the screen. "The soldier man? He looked really scared, sister. The baby's oxygen was already at 82 when I passed by." Patience scoffed, reaching for her ceramic mug. "He's not scared, he's arrogant. That's how they are. If you give them an inch, they will take the whole hospital. I told him to go and buy those products to teach him a little lesson in humility. Let him see that in this building, his rank is 0. Besides, Dr. Emeka is in the lounge sleeping. Am I the one to go and wake him for a maybe emergency?" She poured hot water into her mug, the steam rising to coat her face. She felt a sense of righteous power. In a world where she felt undervalued, underpaid by the management and ignored by the elite doctors, exerting control over a man like David was a drug. "But sister," Bimbo ventured, finally looking up. "The order, if it's the surfactant, we really should." "Quiet, Bimbo," Patience snapped, her voice cutting through the hum of the refrigerator. "I've been a nurse since before you learned how to wash your hands. I know a dying baby from a fussy baby. I'll finish my tea, I'll check on the chief's mother in Ward 4, who, by the way, might actually give us a tip, and then I'll deal with the soldier. He can wait. A little waiting never killed anyone." She took a long, slow sip of the tea, closing her eyes and savoring the warmth. In her mind, she was the arbiter of time. She didn't see the digital clock on the wall ticking toward 5 a.m. She didn't see the silent plea in the baby's eyes through the glass. She only saw her own reflection, polished and in control. 2 floors below, in the hushed shadows of the postoperative recovery ward, the world was a blur of white sheets and the rhythmic drip hiss of an 4-bag. Chidinma Okoro woke up not to a sound, but to a void. It was a physical sensation, as if a thread that had been pulled taut between her heart and her womb for 9 months had suddenly snapped. Her skin was clammy, the harmattan chill finally penetrating the hospital blankets. "David," she whispered. Her voice was a dry rasp, her throat scorched from the screams of labor. The room was dark, save for the green glow of the pulse oximeter on her finger. She looked at the empty bassinet beside her bed, the clear plastic cradle that was supposed to hold her son. It was empty, a hollow ribcage of a bed. A sudden sharp pain flared in her abdomen, the reminder of the hemorrhage and the surgeon's frantic stitches, but it was nothing compared to the cold dread rising in her chest. "My baby," she groaned, pushing the blankets aside. Her legs felt like lead. When her feet touched the cold marble floor, the world tilted. She grabbed the edge of the bedside table, sending a plastic cup of water crashing to the floor. The sound was like a thunderclap in the silence. No nurse came. Chidinma didn't wait. She grabbed her stand, using it as a makeshift crutch. Every step was a fresh agony, a tearing sensation that made her vision swim with black spots. She reached the door of her room and leaned against the frame, gasping for air. The hallway was a long, white tunnel. She remembered David's face before they took her into surgery, the way he had gripped her hand, promising her that he would watch over the boy. David is there, she told herself, her voice a sobbing breath. David is guarding him. But the void grew larger. As she limped toward the elevators, she passed a large window overlooking the hospital gardens. The sun was just beginning to touch the tops of the Abuja trees, turning the dust of the harmattan into a golden haze. It was a beautiful morning, the kind of morning she had imagined taking her son home. She reached the elevator bank and pressed the button for the 3rd floor. The wait felt like an eternity. When the doors finally slid open, she saw her own reflection in the polished brass of the elevator interior. She looked like a ghost, her hospital gown stained, her eyes sunken, her hair a wild halo. The elevator rose with a sickeningly smooth motion. Ding! The doors opened to the 3rd floor. The first thing she smelled was the antiseptic. The second thing she heard was the silence. She emerged into the hallway, her stand clattering loudly on the marble. She saw a figure at the end of the long corridor, standing in front of a wall of glass. It was a man in camouflage, his shoulders slumped in a way she had never seen in all their years together. Even from behind, she could see the defeat in the curve of his spine. "David," she called out. It wasn't a shout, it was a whimper. She saw him turn. The look on his face, the raw bleeding horror in his eyes, told her everything before he even opened his mouth. Behind him, through the glass, she saw the flurry of white coats, the code blue light spinning like a demonic sun, and the bag of medicine lying discarded on the floor like a piece of trash. Chidinma's knees gave way. The stand fell with a heavy metallic clang, the glass bottle of saline shattering against the floor. She didn't feel the glass cutting her feet. She only felt the silence of the 3rd floor, a silence that was louder than any cry her son would ever make. In that moment, the two worlds collided, the vanity of the nurse who thought she owned time, and the agony of the mother who knew that time had just run out. The code blue light, which had been spinning in a frantic rhythmic crimson, finally flickered and died. Its departure left the hallway in a state of artificial sterile brightness that felt more violent than darkness. Inside the NICU, the doctors began to peel away from the incubator like shadows retreating from a campfire. They moved with the slumped shoulders of men who had fought a losing battle, not against death itself, but against the minutes that had already been squandered. Sister Patient stood by the door, her hand still resting on the electronic keypad. The fear in her eyes was no longer about her job or the aggressive soldier. It was the primal fear of a human being who has realized, too late, that they have committed an act of irreversible negligence. She looked at the floor, where the medicine bag lay in a puddle of spilled tea, the clear plastic crinkling as a doctor's shoe brushed past it. David didn't move toward her. He didn't even look at her. He was staring through the glass at the small, still bundle on the table. Baby Chidi looked peaceful now, the struggle for air finally over, but to David, that peace was a scream that filled the entire world. The door hissed open. Dr. Emeka stepped out first. He took off his surgical mask, revealing a face that had aged 10 years in the last hour. He looked at David, then at the shattered stand and the woman Chidinma, who was collapsed on the floor a few yards away. "Sergeant," the doctor began, his voice thick with a genuine heavy grief. I don't have the words. We tried to resuscitate, but the pulmonary distress was too advanced. By the time we administered the surfactant." "By the time you administered it," David interrupted, his voice a low, terrifyingly calm monotone, "the bag had been sitting in the hallway for 40 minutes. Dr. Emeka looked sharply at Sister Patience. She didn't meet his gaze, she looked at the marble floor as if she hoped it would open up and swallow her whole. The silence that followed was the heaviest thing David had ever carried, heavier than his rucksack, heavier than the memory of the fallen in the northeast. A haunting, guttural sound broke the silence. It was Chidinma. She had managed to pull herself up onto her knees, her hands clutching her stomach where the stitches pulled and burned. She wasn't crying yet, she was making a sound like a wounded animal, a low rhythmic keening that vibrated through the glass walls. David turned. He walked toward his wife, his heavy boots making no sound on the blood and saline-slicked floor. He knelt beside her, his large, calloused hands framing her face. "Chidinma," he whispered. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I had the medicine. I was right here. I was standing right here." Chidinma looked past him, her eyes fixed on the nurse. She didn't see a medical professional, she saw the person who had stood between her husband's love and her son's life. With a strength that should have been impossible for a woman who had nearly bled to death hours before, she pointed a trembling finger at Patience. "You," Chidinma gasped, her voice raw. "You saw him. You saw my husband. He told you the baby was dying." Patience finally looked up, her face twisting into a defensive mask, the last reflex of a failing ego. "Madam, you don't understand the pressure we are under. There were other patients. I didn't know. You didn't care." Chidinma's voice rose into a scream that shattered the professional veneer of the third floor. "You looked at his uniform and you decided my son wasn't worth your time. You drank tea while my Chidi was gasping for breath." David stood up. He didn't help Chidinma up yet, he turned back to the nurse. The air around him seemed to darken. The junior nurses who had gathered at the end of the hall shrunk back. There was no shouting from David, no military command mentality. There was only the cold, hard clarity of a man who had seen too much death to be fooled by excuses. He walked over to the bag of medicine. He picked it up. He looked at the receipt stapled to the top. The timestamp showed 4:58 a.m. He looked at the wall clock, 6:15 a.m. "In my line of work," David said, his voice echoing in the hallway, "if I hesitate for 1 minute at a checkpoint, people die. If I decide I am too tired to check a perimeter, my brothers in arms don't go home to their wives. I am held accountable by the law, by my commanders, and by my God." He stepped closer to Sister Patience. She flinched, expecting a blow. Instead, he simply held the bag out to her. "Take it," he said. "Keep it. Maybe the next father who comes through those doors won't be wearing a uniform. Maybe you'll decide his child is worth the 60 seconds it takes to open a door." He let the bag drop. It hit her shoes with a soft thud. David turned back to Chidinma. He scooped her up in his arms, ignoring the way his own back groaned under the weight. He held her against his chest, her face buried in his camouflage tunic, her tears soaking through the fabric. "We are leaving," David said to Dr. Emeka. "Sergeant, your wife. She needs medical clearance. She's still convalescent. She could hemorrhage again," the doctor pleaded, reaching out a hand. "She will not stay another minute in a place where time is traded for tea," David replied. He looked at the beautiful glass doors, the manicured gardens visible through the windows, and the expensive art on the walls. "You have a beautiful building, doctor. But there is no life in it." David walked through the hospital lobby. The morning sun was now a brilliant, blinding white, cutting through the harmattan haze. The receptionists stared. The security guards, who had saluted him so proudly the night before, stood in awkward silence as they watched the sergeant carry his broken wife toward the exit. He placed Chidinma in the passenger seat of the Peugeot. He walked around to the driver's side, but before he got in, he looked back at the third-floor window, the glass of the NICU. He could see his own reflection in the distance, a small solitary green figure against a sea of white stone. He realized then that the war he had been fighting in the north was simple. There, the enemy wore a different face. Here, in the heart of the city, in the beautiful environment of peace, the enemy was something far more dangerous: indifference. He started the car. The engine's roar was a lonely sound in the quiet morning. As he drove out of the gates of Silver Crest, the 2022 sun rose higher, casting long distorted shadows across the road. He reached over and took Chidinma's hand. They didn't speak. There were no words left for the year they had entered. Behind them, the hospital stood tall and shimmering, a monument of glass and marble, perfectly silent, perfectly cold, while on the floor of the third-floor corridor, a yellow bag of medicine sat in a drying puddle of tea, a testament to the minutes that had stolen a life. The aftermath of tragedy is rarely loud. For Sergeant David Okoro and Chidinma, the weeks following that dusty January morning in 2022 were defined by a silence so heavy it felt like a third person living in their small apartment on the outskirts of Abuja. The beautiful environment of Silver Crest Medical Center was now a ghost that haunted their conversations, a gleaming white tomb that had swallowed their future. David had returned to his duties, but he was a different man. The discipline was still there, the spine was still straight, but the light in his eyes had been replaced by a cold, simmering stillness. He spent his days at the command center, staring at maps of the frontier, but his mind was perpetually trapped behind a soundproof glass door on the 3rd floor. It was late February when David found himself back at Silver Crest. He wasn't there for a fight, though his heart hammered against his ribs like a drum of war as he stepped through the sliding glass doors. He was there to settle the final bill, a bureaucratic cruelty that required him to pay for the very room where his son had died. The hospital was as beautiful as ever. The harmattan dust had settled, and the gardens were being watered by a sprinkler system that created tiny mocking rainbows in the air. As David walked toward the administration wing, he detoured. His boots, polished to a mirror shine, led him instinctively toward the elevators. He pressed the button for the 3rd floor. The NICU hallway was quiet. The code blue light was dark. The marble floors shone with a fresh coat of wax. And there, standing at the nursing station, was Sister Patience. She looked different without the tea mug. She looked smaller, her shoulders hunched as she scribbled notes into a ledger. When she looked up and saw the tall dark shadow of the soldier in his desert camouflage, she froze. The pen slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the desk. "Sergeant Okoro," she whispered. Her voice lacked its former sharp edge. It was brittle, like dry leaves. David didn't stop until he was standing directly across from her. He didn't lean over the desk. He didn't shout. He simply looked at her, a long searching look that stripped away her professional mask and forced her to see the man behind the uniform. "I didn't come here to hurt you, sister," David said, his voice a low, steady vibration. "I came to see if you remember." Patience swallowed hard, her hand trembling as she reached for her pen. "There was an inquiry, Sergeant. The board, they looked at the logs. They said the meconium aspiration was severe. They said the outcome was likely inevitable." "The board wasn't standing behind the glass," David replied. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small crumpled yellow slip of paper, the original order he had carried through the streets of Abuja. He laid it on the desk between them. "The board didn't see you drinking tea while the monitors turned red. They didn't see the time you stole from a boy who only had minutes to live." For a moment, the old Sister Patience flickered to life. Her eyes narrowed, a defense mechanism born of years of avoiding accountability. "You cannot blame me for the failures of the system, Sergeant. We are understaffed. We are tired. The pharmacy was closed because of—" "The system didn't turn its back on me," David interrupted, leaning in just enough for her to see the reflection of the hallway in his pupils. "You did. You saw my uniform, and you decided I was an enemy. You decided that my pain was a performance. You used your power to make me wait, not because you had to, but because you could." Patience looked away. The silence of the hallway, once her greatest ally in dismissing the pleas of Patience, now felt like an accusatory weight. In the quiet, she could almost hear the muffled hum of the monitors from that morning. She looked at the yellow paper on the desk. It was a physical manifestation of a father's love, and her own indifference. "I wake up every night," she said suddenly, her voice so thin it barely reached his ears. "I see the blue light. I see the bag on the floor." "Good," David said. It wasn't a wish for vengeance, it was a statement of justice. "That memory is your cross now. I have to carry a small coffin. You have to carry the knowledge that you let it happen." David turned to leave, but he felt a hand on his sleeve. It was Chidinma. She had entered the ward behind him, walking slowly but without the stand. She was dressed in a vibrant wrap of deep blue, the color of a twilight sky. She looked at the nurse, not with the screaming rage of the morning of the death, but with a profound, quiet pity. "My husband told me not to come," Chidinma said to Patience. "But I wanted you to know something. We named him Chidi. It means God exists. He was only here for a few hours, but he was loved for a lifetime." Chidinma reached out and placed a small hand-woven baby blanket on the desk next to the prescription slip. It was white with a small embroidered lion in the corner. "Keep this," Chidinma said. "Put it in that room. The next time you feel like the system is too heavy, or you feel like the person in the hole is just another Oga soldier, look at this lion. Remember that everyone who walks through those glass doors is someone's world." The nurse began to weep. It wasn't the loud performative crying of someone seeking forgiveness, it was the silent, racking sobs of someone finally realizing the cost of their ego. David took Chidinma's hand. They walked toward the elevator together. As the doors began to slide shut, David saw sister patients pick up the small white blanket. She clutched it to her chest, her head bowed over the nursing station. They walked out of Silver Crest for the last time. The Abuja sun was high and fierce, burning away the last of the year's dust. David led Chidinma to the car. Before he started the engine, he looked at her. "Where to, David?" she asked. "Home," he said. "We have a life to rebuild. And we have a son to remember." As they drove away, the camera, if there were one, would pan out to show the hospital, a shimmering fortress of glass and steel, beautiful and cold. But inside, for the first time in years, a nurse was walking toward the NICU with a white blanket and a heart that had finally broken open. The story of the soldier and the nurse wasn't just a story of death. It was a story of the terrible price of pride, and the long, slow journey toward a grace that can only be found when the glass finally breaks.